Hello and welcome to our webinar, The Art of the Game, How to Harness Gaming and Strategic Workshops in Pharma Today and Tomorrow, in cooperation with our partner, Deallus. My name is Sarah from WeConnect, and I am happy to welcome all participants and our 4 speakers today. We have Chris Paton, he's a strategic advisor at Deallus, Richard Withers, he's a founder of Deallus, Eugenie Journey, she's principal at Deallus, and Chris Paton, who's managing director at Quirk Solutions. If you should have any questions during the webinar, please enter these into your questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. And there will be a Q&A session after the presentation where we will take the time to answer all your questions. That was all from me for now, and now I'm happy to hand over to Jonas.
Hi everyone. Let's start with maybe a round of introductions a little bit closer from the different speakers. So yes, myself, Chris Paton. Before Deallus, actually was a couple of years with both Amgen and AstraZeneca, in both as a CI manager at AstraZeneca, and then headed up the CI function at Amgen. And if we go way back, I have a PhD in neuroscience. And over the years, my speciality, so to speak, within Deallus have been workshops, among other things. And I've probably run about 120 plus war game scenario analysis, stimulation exercises or workshops, whatever you like to call it, over the years. Richard.
Thank you very much, Jonas. I founded Deallus, I don't know, 15 so years ago now. But previous to that, I suppose I had some background in the army, which included some military intelligence. And I've run countless workshops, war game scenario analysis over that period of time, essentially in pharmaceuticals, but also in aerospace, charities, a bit of government work, and other sectors too. Chris. No.
Eugenie.
Hi everybody, I'm Eugenie Journey. I'm principal at Deallus. Similarly to others, I've been with the community for quite a few years, and in my role in Deallus, I've been sort of designing and sort of leading a number of workshops, games, competitive fitness training courses with quite a variety of kind in pharma and life sciences. Same as Jonas, I way back have an academic background and a PhD in clinical research, but nothing that is relevant for right now.
And I'm Chris Paton. I had 19 years military experience, running obviously a wide range of games during that time. But for the last 8 years, I have been running workshops and games for a large number of different clients in different sectors with different issues to look at. So lots of time spent running games on all sorts of issues.
Cool. And we're extremely pleased actually to be joined by Chris, because as we today talk about the past and the present and the future of workshops, one of the things that we bring to the table here is we think we can be both inspired and learn from practices outside pharma. So obviously Deallus have reached out to Chris and looking at ways to collaborate and learn from each other. With that, let's move on to the goals. So actually, we've had a lot of fun preparing for this, and we hope that some of that fun is going to seep through the internet to you guys. So hopefully there will be a few laughter as we move through. But we also have some more, should we say, serious goals. We do hope that we will be able to share with you some of the learnings that we've done as a company running workshops and war games over the last 15 years. We think that this group will have something to say about likely future trends in the gaming space and workshop space, and what it could mean for you if you are thinking about how you can use workshops in your reality or in your life, so to speak. As I've spoken to already, we hope that Chris can give us some ideas and inspirations from outside the pharma industry. And in the wrap up, we hope that we will come up and give you ideas of both the challenges but also the opportunities that we think workshops can do to help you manage the complexities that we are all facing today, right?
Yeah, I think it's worthwhile pointing out as well, maybe at this stage, that yes, Deallus has been running 15 years, but we did a quick synopsis before we got online, and we worked out that there's actually 84 years worth of experience on gaming in the room, most of which sits with Richard, it would appear.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So one thing that strikes us, well, we talked about workshops here, and if you look at historically in the pharmaceutical industry, and especially in the kind of competitive intelligence community, workshops often meant war games, and to some extent maybe scenario analysis. So on the left-hand side on this slide, you see the kind of workshops that we've probably been running historically, and it's been all about different ways of managing competition. So you have the competitor simulation, which we call the kind of red-blue exercise. You have the more kind of war game with multiple players addressing a very defined event, often a competitive event. If we then jump all the way up to strategic preparedness workshop, which is more the kind of scenario analysis, and in between those, where you maybe do a scenario analysis, identify potential scenarios, and then run war games in those. That's how workshops being utilized a lot and defined. But as we had discussed and prepared for this, we would like to open up for a broader definition of workshop. And as we will see as we go through today, the reason for that is we think that workshops today have a broader applicability or application. Sometimes my English isn't as great as it should be. But the definition we have today is that it's a structured and facilitated sessions, normally with multidisciplinary management teams and expertise, with a clear objective that improves assumptions, supports planning, and or enables decision making.
Yeah, sorry, it's Richard here. Certainly, I'd like to pick up on the assumptions point. As you face greater uncertainty, it's an interesting question, really. As you face greater complexity, greater uncertainty, I recall in the old days, and I'll talk about this in a moment, but the games were really about trying to come up with a plan. What's the plan? Let's refine the plan. But it seems to me now that there's a greater need for improving the assumptions that the organization has about the future, and therefore people can plan more sensibly if there are some shared and probably better assumptions.
Yeah, and I think further to that, there is an element of increased focus on strengthening assumption and planning, but also making sure there's a tangible action roadmap and definition. We see, and we'll discuss that in a few more minutes, but we see an increased willingness to really sort of focus more maybe on the tacticality and the implementation of the discussions that are occurring in a format such a workshop.
Yeah, and I think just leading on, the only thing that concerns me slightly with things like this is that the presumption remains, unless we are a bit more explicit, that this is about positioning or it's about competition or competitive intelligence. And that's something we'll come on to later on when we're talking about lessons from outside of pharma.
Yeah, absolutely. So with that, I'll remind everyone that you can shoot questions at us and we will pick them up either as they come in or at the end, but don't be shy. Now we go into the kind of flow of today's webinar, and we will kick off with Richard talking about the past.
Excellent. It wasn't so long ago. So the first thing you'll see there is an image of me. I'm the character on the right. I seem to have aged incredibly well, actually. That's me 30 years ago. So I was an intelligence officer in the army back in 1987 in the British Army, and I was based in Germany. And indeed, much of our time was spent pontificating and looking over maps of what the Russians would do should they decide to roll across the German plains. Back at the beginning, about 1999, 2000, I then left the military and came into predominantly pharmaceuticals. I think that's really what I'm trying to do now, is maybe draw some links between the two, but really to talk to you about my kind of principal observations, having been around intelligence and wargaming and workshops for about 30 years. So my first observation is I cast my mind back fondly to the fact that in the past, the focus was on defeating a competitor. And it was so simple. It was very clear what winning was about. It really was about destroying what was perceived to be the enemy. And that language I'd heard in workshops in big pharmaceutical companies on the east coast of the US. They were talking about destroying the enemy. And in some ways that was quite interesting and quite funny. But actually since then, the definition of winning has changed so much, because just to beat a competitor is no longer what it's about. Really, in the old days, when to be successful, you would prove better efficacy of your drug versus a competitor in front of the physician. Now you have to really prove value to multiple new stakeholders over time. So, to market access, reimbursement regulators, insurers, and so on. It's very, very difficult to be clear about how to win. And gaming has changed as a result of that. You now see many more stakeholders present in a room in order to get to a better outcome. The next point I would say is about seeking a silver bullet. And I think pharmaceutical companies in the past, around 20 years ago, I did observe and got involved in several workshops where they were thinking very big, trying to cut through the complexity to provide a solution. They wanted to fix and stop cancer, wanted to stop diabetes and these other major diseases. However, over the course of 20 years, I've seen gaming really become something else, which has been sort of delegated, if you like, or relegated to product level engagements, and where it's been about refining plans and making incremental gains and really trying to sneak share in a competitive landscape. And I think of late, I've noticed in the last year, 2 years, it's good to see that with all the change in the environment, at last drug companies seem to be using games in order to work out how we're going to win in this incredibly difficult, fast-changing and dynamic marketplace. The third point I would say is around leaders being very slow to react to distant threats. I was always impressed by how well leaders recognized threats or opportunities when they were quite a way over the horizon. But I was always dismayed by how little was done to address the threat or the opportunity. And I'm not sure if that was down to the fact that sometimes they would put their head in the sand and try and ignore these things, feeling that they maybe could do nothing about it, or really maybe they hadn't really appreciated how large the impact could be. And I certainly have seen over the years games being incredibly successful and effective at galvanizing leadership, at galvanizing teams, not just to track threats as they move towards them, but to do something about them. And I would say that's true now and needs to be true going forwards. Finally, it's clear to me that 20 years ago, workshops were run when companies ran or were launching very, very large products into, I think you would call mega blockbuster type products. So they would get management from around the world, 120 managers from around the world to work together to refine a plan to launch that product or to get into a new competitive space, whether it be a geography or a new disease area. So they were independent, large events. And I think what I've definitely noticed, and I think it's a very good thing, is that now workshops are commonly in the best companies, not in all of the companies, but in the best companies, they are now part of the strategic planning process at product and therapy area level. So very much locked into organizations and really giving the business great value in terms of making sure that that planning process is very honest. So with that, I'll hand over to my colleague, Eugenie.
But before that, I will make a comment. No, but thank you. I think it's important to sometimes know where we're coming from. So, and in the past, another thing, you said leaders not reacting. I think also when I think back about the early war games that I was involved in, talking around the millennium shift, you also had what I call the pie in the sky war games, where you try to do such high level thinking. You wanted to have such high strategic war games, and we also did war games where what if IBM buys Merck, which was all very interesting, and you could learn or have ideas, but there was really no way to implement that or how that drive action, because when you came back from the war game, yeah, no, IBM didn't buy Merck, right? So what am I supposed to do differently today? And I think that that's something that we have evolved, and I think, yeah, Eugenie will talk about that, where today we have less of that problem. But I think that was a disconnect too. So yes, they saw that future threat coming, but the workshop told you about the threat, but not what to do about it.
Yeah, I agree, totally.
No, thank you. That's a very good point. I think we're seeing a lot more of a desire to have a very tangible outcome out of workshop events, right? I think one of the points Richard mentioned is that we do have in the past a lot of focus into running workshop as a very clear standalone engagement, and obviously we still see some of that in our sort of client engagements, right? We have here on the slide a very simple view of some of the breakdown of the work we do with some of our clients, and about 10% of that is still contracts that with objective to have a sort of a workshop or war game or competitive simulation with our clients. But what we do see, and that's obviously individual observation, but also in our sort of own data, is that there is an increasing number of clients that really integrate workshop as a tool to different strategic intelligence engagements. And what we really see, and what we've seen over the last few years, and anticipate we will continue to see, is that there is more and more of an appetite to use workshop events as a tool to integrate sort of strategic intelligence to decision making, to business planning, and making sure that that there's a clear format in which they can work with their teams to obtain a very tangible so what, and not just pie in the sky sort of so what, but very sort of tactically implementable. And a lot of our focus when we run these sort of workshops with our clients is making sure there's not only some clear ideas around actions, but actually a plan to address those with accountabilities and timelines and names down to it, right? So there is that sort of desire to have a very tangible outcome. Jonas, yes?
Yeah, I also to comment on that, I think it's a value if you are running a monitoring program or a more traditional kind of deep dive. I would definitely consider workshops as a way of storylining what's doing, because it's very easy when you do monitoring that you collect a lot of information, but to capture some of the complexities, but also to be able to say, how is competitor X or company X thinking or approaching about this market? You can use workshops as a kind of kick-off to start building a story around competitors' strategic.
It helps you to, basically discern what's the intelligence telling us. So what, right? We need to get in a room, need to work out what this is telling us and maybe what the impact is and therefore what we should do. So workshops at the back of monitoring are absolutely vital.
And more and more what we've seen is that we've run workshop as an integrator of sort of broader ambitions and insights, right? Making sure that none of the collective effort is lost and there is really a clear tangible output of it. From a broader sort of observation point of view, I think currently, right, we still see a lot of focus on having workshop that aims to achieve objectives at product level. Now, when we talk about product level, we don't necessarily talk the us versus them that Richard described about a few minutes ago, but it's really sort of us versus complexity, and making sure that as a pharma company with a very clear defined ambition for a product, there is an ability to better navigate the evolving complexity of sort of our landscape. And an obvious part of that is, yes, of course, competition and how they're shaping that environment and how we can react to it, right? But we still see a lot of desire to help cut through that sort of complex noise at the product level. Another point is obviously that this is in many markets that are getting more and more saturated. I think, to your point, Richard, earlier, the good old days of sort of the blockbuster model are very challenged, right? And there is a lot more of a need to establish strategies that are competitively fit to markets that are a lot more crowded with less clear unmet needs and sort of opportunities.
Yes.
On the leaders front, we are still seeing a very sort of good anticipation of opportunities and threats and realization. To the point we just made, there is more of an appetite to do something very concrete, very tangible about it. And there's also, aligned with that complexity, and Jonas will tell us a bit more about it, a desire to understand sort of the likely disruption coming from evolving trends, and one of that is sort of the involvement of technology, for example. The last point here really goes back to some of those pie charts we showed earlier, which sort of exemplified that there's more of an incorporation, right, of workshops in sort of our clients' business planning. We're seeing that really day in, day out. So a couple of more comments on the sort of product level games, and I'll be quick because I'm getting a 2-minute warning here. But it's really, there is a desire to have a tangible outcome, to have some clear roadmap to addressing what objectives we have as a pharmaceutical company to win with a given product. Now, some of our observation is that there is more of that tactical integration, but also a lot more localization, meaning we do run workshops and war games with global teams or regional teams, brand teams, but also more and more often with affiliate level product teams, and sometimes even integrating sales teams in there to make sure that we have a very good translation of what the sort of ambition at the broader global level might be to sort of the local realities, right? So there is that element of localization that we've seen more and more in the last few years, and that we believe is getting a lot of traction. On the format front, there is obviously a lot of still relevance to have some of the traditional format of workshops, to have 1 full day of 2 days of getting everybody in the room together to really think through some of those challenges, right? But we're also seeing some of our clients that evolve their own business model and are trying to be more agile around it, right? And we've designed some solution that helps sort of break down sometimes some of the ambition of a workshop in several shorter sessions, for example, having several iterations or iteration with different types of stakeholder groups, looking to achieve similar sort of objectives of competitive fitness and readiness and stronger strategy in that complex environment, but in a bit more of a dynamic way sometimes that better align with our clients' needs.
Thank you. I would make one comment, which I think is important. I think if we look at where Richard started with the past, I would say not all workshops actually, should we say, delivered what we wanted. I would be fairly confident to say that the kind of war games and workshops we've been running in the last, let's say, maybe 10 years or so, or yeah, maybe 10, 15, has been much more fit to purpose, and you often drive. So when you have this kind of clean situation, as I call it, the traditional war game, a commercial situation, a couple of competitors, it's about differentiation. Maybe your tactical areas have been 1 or 2 areas like traditional marketing and market access, that kind of stuff. I think the war games was very good at answering those needs and coming up with very tangible things that the marketing team or the clinical development team could walk away with. I think as we start looking in the future, we're not trying to fix something that was broken with the workshop formats before, but as we will talk more about, is that the world has moved on and we are facing much more complexity. And I think that's also, I'm looking a little bit at Chris here, right? Why we have someone from the outside industry here, is we need to change the way we run workshops when we are facing more of the future-like situations. With that, I would say, if you today find yourself in a more kind of traditional situation, so don't try to make things more complicated than necessary, right? The traditional war game would still answer it. Moving on to the future, sounds nice. the way I see it is, and the way I think about it when I start looking at what trends do we see, I would say, in a way, future is already here. So you heard some of Richard's comment, and actually some of the comments that you made, Oshini, kind of proves or shows the way. So when I started thinking about the trends that we're going to discuss, I kind of looked at the front runners of the 15% early adopters that we see within our clientele, and maybe also where we have been pulled in when it hasn't been the traditional situation, but where we are more helping the clients to maneuver in the kind of more modern, complex environment. And we'll try to make it a little bit more tangible as we move forward. But very quickly, the world is changing, and it's changing faster than ever. And I know that everyone on the line, you've been to different presentations about this, so let's not overkill this. A lot of the kind of general, should we say, developments in the world, some of them is going to pharma as well, right? So if we look at pharma 4.0, you know what is happening, right? There is technological changes, there is changes in the society, economic, new regions coming up, political movements. What it means to us is that we are operating in a world where we have more competitors, we have a new type of competitors or agents in our market. So we're talking about Alphabet or Amazon or IBM. We're also the whole kind of genomics field, gene therapy fields, which bringing in new companies and other new technologies in the kind of bio area. You have the whole digitalization of everything from social media and digital marketing to how you do clinical trials, to how you try to do better diagnostics or prognostics. So fundamentally, the big conclusion is the world is getting a lot more complex, and that complex is accelerating. It's moving a lot faster, and that has a lot of impact on what we have to do as a company to respond to that. And what I hope to demonstrate is I think workshops are uniquely set to help deal with these increased complexities. So if we look at the kind of top trends that I see, and we'll come to another slide where we go in a little bit more detail, I think we will see a lot of new formats and models of what workshop is. The core, I expect, if I look at me as Deallus, I expect that 50% or more of our workshops in the future will be wargame-like. They will be about, sorry about that, on the product level, but we will see, as we're trying to address other complexities, we will need new ways of doing workshops. And as you alluded to, Rashni, we already start seeing that with some smaller workshops, sense-making workshops, etc. The big difference, I think, is also compared to what Richard was talking about. It's not about defeating an enemy. I think we're starting to see more, it's about co-competition, as we call it, which means that it's about winning, finding a winning position or a winning strategy and helping the clients to define what is a winning strategy. Because it's not about being the only one on the street anymore. It's about how do I fit in, and I think that's even more important. For example, let's just pick one area: artificial intelligence, and the whole recognition of that coming to the industry. We've done work with clients where we actually didn't look at one single pharma company. We only work at looking at, if I were some of these tech companies like IBM or Alphabet or whatever company you were thinking about, what is it that they want to accomplish? Where do they come from? How do they make money? Why are they interested moving into healthcare? How would they like to shape the environment in the next 3, 4, 5, 10 years? And only then were we in the discussion to go back and say, when you're trying to define your winning strategy in this evolving, you have to know when are you playing in synergy, I think I'm looking here if I'm using the right word, or when are you at odds with the tech companies? Because there are people who are trying to shape your environment. And if we don't look at these companies out of their perspective, I think we're missing a huge opportunity.
So what you're saying here, Jonas, if I might rephrase,
Absolutely.
is that workshop can be used as a tool, and role play in a workshop can be used as a tool to demystify a potential element of complexity or a potential element of direct or indirect competition.
Yeah.
Questions, I mean, the workshops are very helpful in answering the question, what industry are we now in? Right?
Yeah.
Are we still just a drug manufacturer, or are we now a disease management company, or are we now a company that involves itself more broadly in healthcare? These are massive questions that are becoming asked more and more frequently than they were certainly 10 years ago. And workshops are the best forum, I'm sure of, that help management to answer those kinds of questions.
Yeah. So the other big kind of, and it kind of speaks to what Richard and Eugénie's point here, we experience that leaders are getting actually more involved and are interested in being proactive to kind of solve the problem before it hits them, so to speak, which is a big mental shift, which I think is extremely important. The last trend, I think workshop will be more an obvious and integrated part. So as Eugénie already said, we're seeing more integration, but it still is a little bit of a special thing that we do. I think as we look forward, workshop will just be a very natural integrated thing of how we do business. Like we have meetings today, right? We don't talk about, yes, we run meetings at our company. So that's where I think stuff is going. If we go a little bit more into detail in the next slide, as I said, I still think traditional war games will be around and will probably be at least half or the majority in the pharmaceutical industry. We will see some changes there though. The scope will be wider. There is less focus on us against those three competitors. It's more about how do I position myself or how do I strategize in the healthcare ecosystem. We will see new players, as I already talked about, like tech companies or genomic companies, which you have to understand. If you want to be a disease management company today, you have to understand where insurance is going, where data is going, where diagnostics is going, because previously, like 15 years ago, when it was also trendy to talk about disease management, that was all about getting a portfolio of products.
Yeah.
Today, if you're going to manage a disease area, you have to be on top of a lot of other stuff.
Yeah, and I think there is a strong element here of providing more and more integrated solutions, right, to disease management. And an element is the pharmaceutical product, but there's so many other components from sort of software to tech to apps and sort of different ways of engaging the entire sort of pool of sort of the caring model, right? There's a lot more centricity around the patient, but there's an entire ecosystem around this that needs to be addressed, and that some of our clients really push for better understanding and defining the strategies.
So they need to be represented at the workshop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that one recognition that we've done, now we may be getting too detailed here, but when you start looking at some of the more ambitious tech companies, they want to be a disease management company, and then we as a drug manufacturer, we just want part of that, but they want to play in the whole field. The other thing, as I said, is shift in focus. I think we already addressed that. Is the shift is from kind of finding the silver bullet or the magical solution or the winnings to it's about finding where I fit in, where I can have a winning niche. If we look at diversification, that's the other thing. So as I said, I think we will see a lot of new type of workshops. So we talk about new uses. So workshops that are designed to drive implementation. I think Chris is going to talk a little bit to that later. We have workshops that are actually more focused on sense making, where it's integrated into your monitoring program, etc. Right? We also have how do we deal with disruptions, and here's actually a real example where, Chris, you helped us bringing in this model that you call the pre-mortem model. If you could say a couple of words, because I found it a really interesting way of looking at disruption.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, pre-mortem essentially is a way of considering worst case scenario, but it also helps to break away from that whole confirmation bias, that everybody in the organization is convinced this is going to work, and as long as we believe it will work, it will work. And the pre-mortem approach takes that option away from you, because essentially you imagine that you are at a point in the future. Say you have a 2-year plan to achieve X. You're at that 2-year point in the future. You imagine it's been a complete catastrophe, an utter disaster. And you then get the people in the room to generate reasons why that failure will have happened. And then you flip very quickly from that into, so how can we mitigate against those and avoid those in the first place? So a relatively straightforward concept, but it can be quite damaging if you're not careful, and it becomes almost a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
And it can cause difficulties with relationships within the organization as people start to blame one another for mistakes that haven't even happened yet. But I guess that's where having a skilled, gaming consultancy or third party running those sorts of things becomes quite powerful.
Yeah. We use this actually in a situation where people say, so how's the tech industry going to hit us? And that's okay, I think, to kind of wonder about that. The problem is sometimes it leads to paralysis.
Yeah.
But what we did in the way is actually using your methodology to say, okay, so the tech is here. What is they want to accomplish? Now imagine they accomplished everything the way they wanted in the worst disastrous way for you. What had happened and what could you have done differently? Because what we could advise the client on immediately is to say, here's things that you should do. Don't wait, because at least this will make sure that you don't end up in the kind of worst case scenario, right?
Exactly.
The other thing that you will see, obviously, as you do these are new participants. The last piece I'm going to talk about is just integration. And that's part of this workshop being an obvious part of how we do business. So we will use it to refine decision making or to make decisions. We'll talk a little bit about the complexity of making decisions. I think we will see workshops much more integrated into broader strategic intelligence initiatives. So like you said, if you're having the agile approach, the workshop as part of the sprint, for those of you who work in that area, but part of any kind of monitoring or sense-making work. And the other thing I will think we will see more of is combinations of workshops, where, for example, you might run a traditional workshop to come up with, this is the ultimate positioning of our product. Now, in the complex world of my affiliation or in my country, which channels am I going to use? How do I coordinate the sales reps, the field reps, the clinical marketing, the medical marketing, the digital marketing? And that is where workshop can help drive all the way.
Yeah, and just one comment on that. Another example combination is, and Chris is going to take us through some of that as well, but making sure you involve sort of different types of stakeholders around the table. Obviously in pharma, we do a lot of advisory boards, right? But there's a way to sort of integrate some of that to a more sort of traditional workshop or competitive simulation objective, which is also a point that we'll expect to see a little bit more demand for in the future.
Yeah. So moving to the world outside our little box.
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose the first thing that's interesting for me, listening to everybody else talking as we've gone through this and as we prepared for this, is that outside of pharma, essentially, organizations have already diversified their use of games. A lot of the things you see on the screen there, they're sort of drawn from the last 4 years of clients we've worked with in the different sectors that you can see on the screen. But for example, there's a big one there on change and transformation. Change and transformation is a significant problem for lots of organizations. So why not use a game, yes, as a way of exploring what the change is going to be, but actually of socializing the change with the people it's going to impact upon it. So these organizations are bringing in the stakeholders who are going to be affected by the change to give them an opportunity to experience the change in advance, start to become familiar with it, challenge it, question it, to say, well, you're actually creating a solution to a problem I don't have. So all of these things become really powerful. Growth and expansion, or M&A, whatever it might be, legislation change, closing down sites. I suppose the one thing that therefore comes from this is, in these games, you're trying to represent the ecosystem that Jonas, you mentioned earlier on, all in the one room at the one time.
Yeah.
So yes, if you're looking at something on growth and expansion, doubtless there will be some sort of representation of a competitor in the room. But you're also going to have suppliers, existing clients, future clients, people from your own internal functions like marketing, like finance, operations, logistics, because the worst thing in the world is for sales and marketing to be going out there and creating such a huge demand that operations then can't keep up, and you start to suffer reputationally. So I think outside of pharma, the focus is not so much, if you like, you want to take a high level picture, it's not so much on positioning, it's not so much about the competitor, it's more about the strategy execution.
Yeah.
There are still games being done where it is about, you know, my strategic position, but often it's actually also being used around, well, given that strategic position I want to try and achieve, what options do I have? Let's use the games to be creative, to come up with ways in which I could achieve this, maybe 3 or 4 different ways. And then maybe further down the planning cycle, having identified which option we want to go for, let's health check it and road test it to make sure it's fit for purpose before we roll it out.
Can I just add, I think over the years, one of the biggest criticisms I've heard of gaming is that sometimes the implementation just drops away. People come out of the workshop and then they go back to their real world and forget some of the outputs that the war game or the workshop generated. And to Chris's point there, I think one of the changes that we see now is a much greater appreciation of the fact that we must build in very resilient, pragmatic plans to implement. And if that's the case, then the people who come to workshops no longer are just the leadership, but they are the people who will be involved in the manufacture, in the distribution, and so on. Because if they're not there, how do you know that what you just signed up to is actually deliverable?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the key learnings that we've got up here, you know, that, and organizations outside Pharma, certainly the organizations that we work with, we're always pushing them to use a vertical slice of the organization. So if you're considering a global, you know, level issue, then you should have regional level representations, you should have country level representation. If you're within a single business, within a single country, you want to have the people who are delivering at the forefront to be involved in the games. There's 2 reasons for that. The first is, as you quite rightly point out, you know, Richard, they are the people who are going to tell you that your grand plan is not going to work. Okay, you can just at a very high level convince you know what you know, and you don't know how that granularity. But the other one that I think is more powerful in a way, and that people don't appreciate with games, is it's a way of creating advocates and champions through your organization to then deliver it. As soon as you start to get a vertical slice of, you know, of individuals starting to percolate out amongst their peers saying, this is coming, this is what's going on, I've been involved in it, therefore I feel a sense of ownership, the much more likely it is that the strategy execution will happen. The challenge comes at times using that approach, though, that much more wide ecosystem approach, is that, you know, what is the balance you want between real and played stakeholders? Clearly, you're not going to bring in a competitor for real. That's going to be role played. But if you are looking to improve your supply chain or something along those lines, then why not bring in elements of your supply chain for real? Not everybody wants to bring in clients because they don't want clients to be perceived to be boxed into some sort of category. But you can almost use games as a way of pre-selling what you're going to do, to run them with the client, to say, this is where we think we're going. What do you think? How would you change it? What do you want to shape it in this way? So depending on your level of risk as to how much you want to expose, they can be very powerful in that way.
I think that just to comment on that, because we discussed this, right? And there is something, in general, I would say in the pharma, there is a little bit of a hesitation of bringing in sometimes the externals for some of the reasons you said, but I think that's where you can use ways. Yes, you can role play, as you mentioned before. You can do, maybe you develop and then you do what is it called, the focus group afterwards. But to your point too, that sometimes if you look at a supply chain, bringing in people who are consultants of us or subcontractors of us in supply, I don't see a problem with. So I think that's where you can use your judgment too, is to say, where are we looking at people that we need to collaborate with or who are supplying us versus direct clients
Yeah.
or competitors, right?
Exactly, which brings us on to the next point really about creating the safe space.
Yeah.
So this can be done either, from a legislative perspective. You can put in place your NDAs, your protection, your contracts.
What do you mean by safe space?
Well, that's the thing really. It's a safe space within which people feel that the other side of it is people feel that they are able to challenge and that they are able to be challenged.
At the workshop?
At the workshop.
Right.
So the workshop needs to feel like a safe space within which people are given the opportunity to express their views. And in some sort of sectors, if you like, that we've worked in, it's much easier. So in the creative, particularly the technology industries, they are so used to challenging each other and being very open, being very creative. The leadership is comfortable being challenged, and people are comfortable with posing a challenge that aren't the leaders, because that's how they operate. If you get into much more heavy-end industries, particularly engineering, which can be quite hierarchical, then they really aren't very comfortable with that. So this isn't just about bringing in a supplier under an NDA and that's now created a safe space. It's actually about working with people in advance of the workshop, time taken in advance of the workshop to sit down with people and say, this is how it works, this is what it's going to feel like for you, these are the behaviors we want you to demonstrate, and these are the values we want you to demonstrate. So it gives people a sense that, well, here's business as usual over here, and temporarily we're going to step into this safe space where all bets are off and we can make sure we really challenge the plan.
Yeah.
And then the learnings we draw from that, we take back to business as usual to make it happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, there's lots of organisations who use it. I mean, over 5 years we worked with Shell, and we did an initial piece of work with them very early on decommissioning of oil platforms in the North Sea, where they had, I think it was something like 18 different stakeholders playing, but most of them were role played. Some were for real, but most of them were role played. Used the process over 5 years, and the benefits they saw from the process meant that one of the most recent ones we did with them, which was around the announcement on going carbon neutral with Shell and then change of policy for Shell, they actually brought in environmentalists for real into the game.
Wow.
And the hard time that they got was phenomenal, but it meant that the outcomes were enormously powerful from their perspective, and also from the environmentalist perspective, because they're starting to get an understanding of, we can't go as far as you would like us to go for regulatory reasons or anything else. So it's helping everybody get a better understanding of the complexity.
Wow, this is super valuable. We're going to try to summarize our kind of speeches here, so to speak, or our presentations, and then open up for a Q&A. So to summarize, I use this slide. I think it's quite clear to me, if I look across the time, so to speak, from the past to the present, and we look across these different dimensions that we spoke about, how it's gone from defeating one or two competitors to adapting a winning position and helping clients to define, or you are running a workshop, helping your organization to define a winning proposition. This change in trying to find one solution that solves everything, to understanding that no, it's not about a silver bullet. It is often more complex. It's not always perfect. And instead of owning the whole market, you own your niche. I think a big shift we see in the leadership is from this of knowing of a threat and being unable to do something about it, or accepting the implications of it, to being much more interested to proactively find a space in the future. And then, as we say, the integration of workshops into business, increasing more and more. Another way of maybe thinking about this is what really driving these changes is changes in the environment. And to summarize it very easy, it's getting more complex. That requires and drives a change in our strategy. And to facilitate that change, we need a new set of workshops. So the question that we want you to start thinking about is your future workshops. What uses do I see for workshops in my reality? what really drives any workshop is the definition of why you're running it, the purpose of the workshop. From that will come which are the stakeholders we need to cover in the workshop. What are the participants that we need to invite, given everything that we heard from Chris or others? Which is the best format? Am I running a pre-mortem? Am I running a more kind of more modern war game, or am I actually running a sense-making or implementation workshop? How do I engage people, and who do I engage? And I think that it's worth stressing this, of how you manage key participants and stakeholders sometimes about our expectations of their role and how they can ruin a workshop if they go about business in the wrong way or in their old way. Think about where you can find inspirations. It sounds a little bit like a love thing here, but we found inspiration from Chris. No, but where else can you find inspiration to discuss these ideas? And obviously, what are the solutions that we can come up with? With that, any other kind of closing words before we start looking at our little Q&A?
No, I don't think so. No.
Yeah. So I think, Chris, you captured some questions coming in from the audience.
Yeah.
You would be willing to share that with us?
Yeah, sure. I mean, and for everybody that's out there still listening, if you hadn't realised, so the panel on the right-hand side of the screen, you've got a chat function. And some people have been, please use that chat function to type through and to send us your questions, and we'll basically answer them in the time between now and the end of the webinar for those that haven't sent them through yet. But there was a good question which I think is worth looking at, which is where do games fail?
Interesting.
Why are you looking at me?
Because I don't want to start.
Well, I think we've been talking about the complexity of the environment, but actually games are complex things to put together. You need to understand what you're trying to do. And I think, first of all, therefore, one of the problems of gaming is the expectations are too high. Sometimes you organize a game, you design one for the client then says, oh, and can we do this as well? Can we do this as well? And can we do this as well? And of course, you try and accommodate them as much as you possibly can. But the fact is, you need to nail down a very clear purpose. A very clear expectation setting is, to me, the single greatest critical success factor. Without that clear definition of purpose, you are bound to fail, because at the end of the workshop, how will you know if you've accomplished anything if you haven't delivered on that purpose? So clarity of purpose drives everything: who attends, when the workshop is, and so on. So the place to start, if you really want to fail, is having a very vague purpose.
Yeah, and to build on that, I would say, make sure it's the purpose of, should we say, what we sometimes call the internal sponsor. So often the client comes to us, but there is actually a stakeholder inside the organization that owns it. So, I mean, I had a pain story, right? When I stood up, presented the war game at the beginning of the workshop, and the highest ranking person in the room stand up and say, I don't know why we're doing this. And that's how I learned to, whenever I get involved, is before I sign off. So that purpose drives everything, but it's the purpose that needs to be anchored with the senior.
Engage early.
Yeah.
Engage early.
And that speaks.
Yeah.
Sorry, that speaks to your point, Chris, about making sure there is enough time invested in the preparation phase to make sure everybody, regardless of whether they're internal or external advisors, right, are actually really on board and align with what not only just the purpose of the event, right, but also sort of the format and what will be expected of them, how they might sort of feel and react in sort of participating.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is key around the behaviours piece and about what you want from people on the day, and that sort of cultural piece, but also actually down to the real nitty gritty of giving them sight ahead of time of the topic that you're going to be looking at, even if it's at a very high level brief. So you don't end up with that horrible situation of people walking into the room going, what's this meeting? Why am I here? Or you spend the first however amount of time trying to get people into the context. I think that, we've certainly found that actually at times some of the best, if you like, challenges and outcomes that have come from a game haven't come from within the game itself. It's come from the meeting a week or so ahead of the game, when you're socializing the topic with people and they're saying, well, what about this? Yeah. What about that? And you're saying, well, hang on to that question for the game. But it's about getting them read into it so they come in fully ready to go in all respects.
I think another kind of nitty-gritty detail potentially is having the right participants. So we talked about senior stakeholder management and the purpose, right? But once, if you don't have the right expertise there, and it could be internal, external, but I think it's who owns the question afterwards. So another bad story about failure. We ran a market access war game in US, where the US market access team wasn't invited, it was only the global. So yes, you come up with some interesting conclusions, but you didn't have the experts in the room doing it. And afterwards, you came back to the US organization and said, everyone outside US thought about your market access situation, and here's our recommendations. It has absolutely no validity, right? So I think it's, but the overarching is the one you brought up, Richard. If you don't get the purpose right, you're screwed.
On that note, I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, so I've got two. So I guess we can decide and hopefully try and maybe skip across both. The first is, what is the most appropriate point to run a game in the cycle of a strategy or a plan?
So, I will lead because it's traditional. The oldest go first.
I go last.
I think I would definitely say you need to run a workshop that gives you enough time to react and put in place the plan that the workshop has spent its time developing. If you try and run a launch workshop, as we have been invited to do, 2 weeks before a launch, there is no point, because you can make no change. You could delay the launch, but that probably won't make you very popular inside the business. So you need to have enough time to implement the changes and the actions that the game has delivered, first and foremost.
I think there's a time piece, but for me, nearly every comment I ever get is, I wished we'd done this sooner.
Yeah, right.
So I think that people often feel like they have to get to a point where there is a degree of fidelity around the plan, because otherwise they feel like they're exposing themselves too soon to thinking that isn't fully formed.
Yeah.
I think that these sorts of workshops can be used to help signpost where you might go. So done really early, as long as you manage the expectations of the people coming into the room, that look, this is being done really early. Yeah. We don't yet have a plan. We're using this as a way to create the signpost of where we might go and where we might play and how we might win is really useful. And I think that also then helps you to avoid that whole sunk cost fallacy, where you run the game at a point at which a decision has already been made to go in a particular angle, and now you've invested in it, nobody wants to change it because it feels like failure.
I think to that question too, I would say, if I look at my trends, I would actually say, maybe what we will see is that you do them at all times. Yeah. So I could, for example, if we're thinking about us doing a commercialization of a product, yes, you want a global war game to inform your phase 3 design. You probably want a regional war game to start thinking about how you're going to position your product. And then you want affiliate workshops on how you're actually going to drive the actual launch itself. Yeah. So I think that the point is, you can do it at different times, and every time has their merit, but then you have to design it given to what is it that we're trying to influence in terms of our actions.
Absolutely. So,
and I think I see a lot of signs that we are coming up to 4 o'clock or 3 o'clock, depending on where you are in the world. Well, it could be anything. It's always 12 o'clock somewhere in the world, so we can go ahead with beer. On that note, huge thanks for everyone calling in. I hope that you've had some value of our discussions. I know it's always tricky. These are kind of generic observations, etc. If you feel that you are in a very complex situation, or where you would say, I would like to hear what someone like Chris or Richard or Jonas or Eugenie might have to say about my particular situation, don't hesitate to get in touch with us. There is no obligations to that. We're just happy to chat with you around that. You can get in touch either with Eugenie, you see her email here, or Chris, you see his email as well. And with that, I say thank you to the panel. and to the Sarah who has helped organize this, and everyone who has listened to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, also from my side, thanks a lot to all of you for the very insightful and detailed presentation, and of course also for answering the questions. And yeah, to all the participants, thanks for tuning in into our webinar today. We really hope that you liked it and would be very happy to welcome you again in one of our next webinars. Have a nice day and goodbye.